Welcome to Vices and Volumes, the podcast that brings forgotten stories from the 1800s back to life. I'm Avril, and each episode I dive into old books, manuscripts and journals to uncover the fascinating tales, beliefs and characteristics that shaped our past. From gothic ghost stories to social customs, from scientific curiosities to supernatural folklore. If it's tucked away in these pages of history, I'm going to find it and I'm going to share it with you. Before we begin, please note that this episode is about witch trials and may contain some accounts of torture, systematic persecution and violence that some listeners may find distressing. Listener discretion is advised. In this two-part series, we'll delve into the world of witches. And tonight we uncover how civilization's greatest achievement, the rule of law, became humanity's most efficient killing machine. Imagine standing in a colonial courtroom in Salem, Massachusetts in the summer of 1692. The air thrums with supernatural dread as young girls writhe in apparent agony, screaming that invisible spirits are attacking them. The accused sits shackled at the defendant's table. Her physical body clearly present in the courtroom, yet the prosecution claims that her spirit has somehow separated from her flesh to commit acts of diabolic violence miles away. Welcome to the world of spectral evidence, testimony about crimes committed by invisible spirits while the accused body was elsewhere. This wasn't a primitive superstition, but a legal innovation that transformed American jurisprudence into an engine of systematic murder. According to Carol Carlson, research in The Devil in the Shape of a Woman, spectral evidence represented the complete abandonment of traditional legal principles in favor of supernatural prosecution that made defense impossible. The Salem trials didn't emerge from a random panic, but followed procedures established by European witch-hunting manuals that had spent 2 centuries perfecting the art of supernatural prosecution. Matthew Hopkins' techniques in England, the Malleus Maleficarum systems approach, and King James VI's personal involvement in Scottish trials, all of these contributed to a transatlantic system of legal terror that treated invisible crimes as more real than physical evidence. For this podcast, I have used the London Journal 1847 for inspiration from a series of articles called A Few Chapters on Astronomy and Magic. As part of these articles, there was 6 running features on witchcraft alone. And I take this piece from chapter 24, which provides a chilling account of how spectral evidence operated in practice. A conspicuous feature in nearly the whole of the stories was that the named spectral site, in other words, that the accusers first received the injuries and then saw the figures in action of the persons who inflicted them, when they were invisible to everyone else. The persons charged with these misdeeds might be miles distant from the accusers when the charges were made, yet they were immediately taken up and cast into prison. The first specimen of this sort of accusation in the present instance was given by one Paris, a minister of a church at Salem, in the end of the year 1691, who had 2 daughters, one 9 years old and the other 11, who were afflicted with fits and convulsions. The first person fixed on this as the author of what was seen as Tituba, a female slave in the family, and she was harassed by her master into confession of unlawful practices and spells. The girls then fixed on Sarah Good, a female known to be the victim of a morbid melancholy, and Osborne, a poor man who had been for a considerable time bedridden, as persons whose spectres had perpetually haunted and tormented them, and Good was, 12 months after, hanged on the accusation. Consider the legal impossibility created. How do you defend against the charges that your spirit committed crimes when your body was elsewhere? The accusers claimed the supernatural sight allowed them to see invisible assaults that no one else could witness. Alibis became meaningless when prosecutors argued that spiritual bodies could separate from physical ones to commit diabolic acts across vast distances. This legal framework didn't develop accidentally, but represented a systematic corruption of judicial institutions by learned men who understood exactly what they were creating. The intellectual foundation came from Heinrich Kramer and Jacob Springer's Malleus Maleficarum, published in 1487, which provided detailed procedures for identifying, prosecuting, and executing witches with maximum efficiency. The Malleus wasn't merely a theological treatise, but a practical legal manual that transformed European jurisprudence. According to Brian Levac's analysis, The Witch Hunt in Early Modern Europe, the manual created new categories of evidence, redefined the burden of proof, and established torture as a legitimate investigative technique when applied to supernatural crimes. Traditional legal protections, presumption of innocence, right to confront accusers, requirement for credible witnesses were systematically eliminated as obstacles to righteous prosecution. The manual's legal innovations were revolutionary in their systematic abandonment of justice. It established that witchcraft cases required different evidentiary standards because diabolic influence made no normal legal procedures inadequate. Accused witches supposedly possessed supernatural resistance to interrogation, justifying enhanced techniques that would have been recognised as torture in other contexts, but became righteous investigation when applied to supernatural criminals. From chapter 21 in the journal, they cover how the manual's legal framework spread across Europe with papal sanction and created travelling death squads. By a bull of Pope Innocent VIII in 1484, death was for the first time denounced without mercy to all who should be convicted of witchcraft or dealings with Satan, and a form of process for the trial was regularly laid down by a man of the name Springer, whom the Pope had placed at the head of a commission of fire and sword. The succeeding popes, Alexander VI and even Leo X, lent their aid in accelerating the course of this havoc-spreading engine. So far, however, were the commissions from being attended with beneficial consequences, that their only effect was to render the evil every day more formidable, till at last, if we were to believe the testimony of contemporary historians, Europe was little better than a large suburb of pandemonium. One half of the population was either bewitching or bewitched. These commissions of fire and sword represented the complete militarization of supernatural prosecution. Papal authority backed travelling courts that could descend on any community with absolute power to investigate, try, and execute suspected witches without regard to local legal traditions or protections. The commissioners answered only to Rome, carrying written authority to override any local resistance to supernatural investigations. The efficiency was terrifying. These mobile tribunals could produce whatever level of diabolic conspiracy their commissioners deemed necessary. Local magistrates who questioned their methods could then themselves be suspected of harbouring supernatural sympathies. The commissions created self-perpetuating systems where resistance to witch hunting became evidence of witchcraft, ensuring their continued expansion across European territories. Political manipulation of this corrupted legal system reached its most cynical expression in the theatrical performance of Richard, Duke of Gloucester, later Richard III, in his use of supernatural charges to eliminate political rivals, and this reveals how witch beliefs became weapons of statecraft. Richard, Duke of Gloucester, afterwards Richard III, shortly before his usurpation of the crown in 1483, had recourse to this expedient for disarming the power of his enemies, which he featured as an obstacle to his project. Being Lord Protector, he came abruptly into assembly of council he held at the Tower and sat down. Shakespeare has helped Sir Thomas More to make the scene which ensued immortal. More says that Richard presented himself on a Friday, the 13th of June, about 9 in the morning. In a very merry humour, after a little talking with them, he said to the Bishop of Ely, "My lord, you have very good strawberries in your garden in Holborn. I request you, let us have a mess of them." "Gladly, my lord," quoted he. "Would to God I had some better thing as ready your pleasures as that." And then, withal, in all haste, he sent his servant for a mess of strawberries. The Protector set the lords fast in communing, and thereupon praying them to spare him a little while, departed thence. And soon after 1 hour, between 10 and 11, he returned to the chamber amongst them all, charged with a wonderful sour, angry countenance, knitting the brows, frowning and fretting, gnawing at his lips, and so set him down in his place. Soon after he asked what those persons deserved who had compassed and imagined his destruction. Lord Hastings answered that they deserved death, whoever they might be, and then Richard affirmed that they were that sorceress his brother's wife, meaning the Queen, and others with her. "And," said the Protector, "we shall see in what wise that sorceress and that other witch of her council, Shore's wife with her affinity, have by their sorcery and witchcraft wasted my body." In saying this, he plucked up his doublet sleeve to the elbow of his left arm, where the arm appeared to be withered and small. As it was never other, the lords perceived that this matter was but a quarrel. And they were all silent except Hastings, who said, "Certainly, my lord. If they so have heinously done, then they be worthy of heinous punishment." "What," quoth the protector, "thou servest me, I ween, with ifs and with ands. I tell thee they have so done, and that will make good on my body, traitor." And therewith, continues Moore, as if in great anger, he clapped his fist upon the board with a great rap, at which token he cried treason without the chamber. Herewith a door clapped, and in came rushing men in harness, as many as the chamber might hold, and anon the protector said to the Lord Hastings, "I arrest thee, traitor." "What, me, my lord?" quoth he. "Yes, thee, traitor," quoth the prosecutor. Another let fly at the Lord Stanley, who struck at the stroke and fell under the table, or else his head had been cleft to the teeth, for as shortly as he shrank, yet ran the blood about his ears. They were then quickly bestowed in drivers' chambers, except the Lord Chamberlain, Hastings, who the protector bade speed and shrive him appearance. "For by St. Paul," quoth he, "I will not dinner till I see thy head off." Hastings was then hurried to the Queen by the side of the Tower Chapel, where he was made to stretch his neck over a log of wood which happened to lie there, and his head immediately struck off. This extraordinary scene reveals witchcraft accusations at their most transparently political. Pure legal theatre designed to justify predetermined murder through supernatural prosecution. Richard's performance was masterful. The friendly request for strawberries, the stage departure and furious return, the display of his withered arm as evidence of a supernatural attack, and the fact that his deformity was congenital made no difference. In a corrupt legal system where witchcraft seemed real, any abnormality could be reinterpreted as evidence of a diabolic assault requiring immediate execution. The speed of the proceedings demonstrates how corrupt the legal system could dispense the normal procedures when supernatural charges were involved. From casual conversation about strawberries to Lord Hastings' head on the chopping block took less than 2 hours. Efficiency that would be impossible under traditional legal protections, but became routine when supernatural emergency justified abandoning normal judicial procedure. Here we see the uncomfortable truth about corrupted legal systems. They serve different purposes depending on who wields the power. Powerful nobles could exploit supernatural accusations as political weapons against specific rivals. The same machinery operated far more systematically against the defenceless. The legal framework that enabled Richard's elimination of Lord Hastings became an assembly line for mass persecution of entire populations. The same corrupted system destroyed hundreds of vulnerable women through routine application of perverted legal principles. As a result of the Malleus Maleficarum's analysis, it stated that women were naturally more susceptible to diabolic influence due to their supposed intellectual weakness and moral deficiencies. The gender dynamics of this corrupted legal system reveals its true purpose. Women comprise roughly of 80% of witch trial victims, while the proportion rising to 90% in some regions. This wasn't coincidental, but reflected systematic targeting of society's most vulnerable members, a system that was designed to silence women. From chapter 20, here's how the pseudo-scholarly justification operated. Sprenger, in his Malleus Maleficarum, endeavours to trace this liability of females, becomes the agents of Satan in preference to men, what he calls their inferiority in mental strength and the natural weakness of their hearts. This theological misogyny provided intellectual cover for what was essentially organised femicide, disguised as supernatural prosecution. Judges could quote scholarly authority while condemning widows, midwives, and healers to death, transforming social prejudice into religious duty through legal procedures that appeared objective and rational. The systematic nature of this gendered persecution becomes clear when we examine who was actually targeted. Elderly women, widows who had inherited property, midwives whose patients sometimes died, healers who practiced traditional medicine, and any woman who challenged gender norms became primary candidates for supernatural prosecution. The legal system provided a mechanism for removing these problematic women while appearing to protect communities from diabolic conspiracy. At the apex of this corrupted system stood kings who didn't merely endorse witch trials but participated directly in torture sessions designed to extract supernatural confessions. King James VI of Scotland represented the ultimate corruption of royal authority, a monarch who took personal pleasure in supervising the systematic destruction of his own subjects through techniques he helped design and refine. The London Journal covers this in chapter 22, where we witness the chilling account of royal participation in torture sessions. King James VI sent a splendid assembly to the court of Denmark with ample powers and instructions to demand the hand of the King of Denmark's second daughter. The treaty was concluded and the princess embarked. But when she had now for some time been expected in Scotland, news was brought instead that she had been driven back by tempests on the coast of Norway. The young king felt keenly his disappointment and gallantly resolved to sail in person for the port, where his intended consort was detained by shattered condition of her fleet. James arrived on the 22nd of October, 1589, and having consummated his marriage, was induced by the invitation of his father-in-law to pass the winter at Copenhagen, from where he did not sail till the spring, and after having encountered a variety of contrary winds and some danger, reached Edinburgh on the 1st of May the following year. It was to be expected that variable weather and storms should characterise the winter season in the seas, but the storms were of longer continuance and more frequent succession than was usually known, and at this period, when the proposed consort of James I, then the king himself, and finally both of them, and the hope of the Protestant succession were committed to the mercy of the waves, it is not wonderful that the process of the season should be acutely marked, and that those varieties which are commonly ascribed to the second causes should have been imputed to the extraordinary and supernatural inference. It was affirmed that in the king's return from Denmark, his ship was impelled by a different wind from that which acted on the rest of his fleet. James's difficult sea voyage and unusual weather patterns became evidence of witches attempting to murder the king through weather magic, creating opportunities for persecution that carried royal sanction and personal royal involvement. From chapter 22, here's the chilling account of how the king took great delight in exacting the confessions through systematic brutality. It was at this period that James personally engaged in the examinations. We are told that he took great delight in being present and putting the proper questions. The unhappy victim was introduced into a room plentifully supplied with implements of torture, while the king waited in the apartment at a convenient distance, till the patient was found to be in a suitable frame of mind to make the desired communications. No sooner did he or she signify that they were ready and should no longer refuse to answer than they were introduced, fainting, sinking under recent sufferings which they had no longer strength to resist, into the royal presence. And here sat James in envied ease and conscious delight, wrapped up in the thought of his own sagacity, framing the inquiries that might best extract the desired evidence, and calculating, with the judgment by no means to be despised, from the bearing, the turn of features, and the complexion of the accused, the probability whether he was making a frank and artless confession, or he still had the secret desire to impose on the royal examiner. The image is profoundly disturbing. A king taking conscious delight in interrogating torture victims, calculating their sincerity while they swayed from recent agony. The confessions extracted from Agnes Sampson under James' personal supervision demonstrate how torture produced exactly the evidence prosecutors wanted to hear. Here's her extraordinary account of the diabolic conspiracy against the royal family. Agnes Sampson related what solicitude she had sought to possess some of the fragment of the linen belonging to the king. If he had worn it and had contracted any soil from his royal person, this would be enough. She would infallibly, by applying her incantations on this fragment, have been able to undermine the life of the sovereign. She told how she, with 200 other witches, had sailed in sieves from Leith to North Berwick Church, how they had there encountered the devil in person, how they had feasted with him, and what obscenities had been practiced. She related that, in this voyage, they had drowned a cat, having first baptized it, and that immediately a dreadful storm had arisen, and in this very storm the king's ship had been separated from the rest of his fleet. She took James aside and, the better to convince him, undertook to repeat him the conversation, the dialogue which had passed from one to the other between the king and queen in their bedchamber on the wedding night. Agnes provided exactly what the prosecution needed. Detailed confession of supernatural conspiracy against royal authority, complete with impossible knowledge that proved demonic contact. Her ability to recite private royal conversations was evidence of actual supernatural surveillance, but of a demonstration of how torture could produce any desired testimony while appearing to validate supernatural prosecution. The most disturbing aspect of this royal participation is how it transformed torture from necessary evil into recreational activity. James wrote scholarly treatises justifying enhanced interrogation techniques while personally supervising their application. James's 1597 treatise Demonology provides theoretical justification for abandoning traditional legal protections when prosecuting supernatural crimes. Since witches had allied themselves with ultimate evil, they forfeited normal human rights and could be subjected to whatever procedures were necessary to extract the truth about diabolic conspiracy. The persistence of supernatural prosecution techniques, long after the formal end of witch trials, demonstrates how deeply these legal innovations had changed the minds of the public. Even when courts stopped executing witches, the procedural methods developed for supernatural prosecution remained available for other purposes when new enemies required systematic elimination. An 1845 case from Scotland reveals how witch beliefs and associated legal attitudes survived well into the modern era. The journal mentions this in chapter 23. Here's the remarkable testimony of a fisherman who still believed in supernatural conspiracy. The following case shows to how great an extent some of the people in this district have still a belief in witchcraft. The story was told by the prisoner himself, a young man of decent appearance and equally apparently to the general persons of the same rank of life, intelligence, and education. I live near Teen, and I'm a fisherman. I'm in prison for assaulting a woman named M.M. She's about 60 years old. I assaulted her because she was bewitching everything I had. She prevented me from catching fish, and she caused my boat to be upset. The other fishermen said they should have no chance of catching any herrings while I was with them, and that they would not let me go out with them. M.M. is known by all in the neighbourhood to be a witch. She's been seen 100 times milking the cows in the shape of a hare, though I never saw her do it myself. People believe in my neighbourhood that if anyone gets blood from a witch, she can do them no more harm. And that's the reason I cut M with my penknife. But I held the knife so that it might go into her as short way as possible. All I wanted was to get blood. I was not the first person who wanted to draw blood from her. Those who advised me to cut her told me that if I did not, she would drown me, and the rest who were in the boat with me as well, as sure as any man was ever drowned. It's hard that I should be put in prison, for the Bible ordered us to punish witches, and there was not a man on the jury who did not know M to be a witch. This testimony contains every element of classical witch prosecution. Unexplained misfortune attributed to supernatural malevolence. These ancient legal attitudes retained enough credibility to motivate assault and find support among jury members who knew the victim was a witch. Shape-shifting accusations represent perhaps the most sophisticated form of supernatural evidence used in corrupt legal proceedings. Unlike other forms of witchcraft that required witness testimony about specific actions, metamorphosis charges could be proven through correlation between animal encounters and human injuries that seemed to demonstrate supernatural transformation. The legal brilliance of shape-shifting charges lay in their apparent objectivity. Courts could point to physical evidence, injured animals and wounded humans, that seemed to prove the supernatural transformation without relying solely on witness testimony about invisible events. The timing and nature of injuries created circumstantial evidence that appeared conclusive to judges trained to find diabolic conspiracy wherever they looked. From chapter 26 of the London Journal, here's the extraordinary account of how shape-shifting evidence was discovered and prosecuted. Captain Burse, an officer of engineers who, about the year 1730, was sent into the north of Scotland on government service, used to relate the following particulars of an interview between himself and a minister whom he met at the house of a nobleman. After the minister had said a good deal concerning the wickedness of such diabolical practice as sorcery, and that, in my turn, had declared my opinion of it, he undertook to convince me of the reality of it by example as which follows. A certain Highland laird had found himself at several times deprived of some part of his wine, and having as often examined his servants about it, and none of them confessing, but all denying it with asseverations, he was induced to conclude that they were innocent. The next thing to consider was how this could happen. Rats, there were none to father the theft. Those, you know, according to your philosophical way of thinking, might have drawn out the corks with their teeth, and then put in their tails, which being long and spongious would imbibe a good quantity of liquor. They might suck it out again, and so on until they had emptied as many bottles as were sufficient for their numbers and strength of their heads. But to be more serious, I say there was no suspicion of rats, and it was concluded that it could be done by none but witches. Here the new Inquisition was set on foot, and who they were was the question. But how should that be discovered? To go the shortest way to work, the laird made choice of one night, an hour when he thought it might be watering time for the hags, and went to his cellar without a light, the better to surprise them. Then with his naked broadsword in hand, he suddenly opened the door and shut it after him, and fell into cutting and slashing around about him, till at last, by opposition of the edge of the sword, he concluded that he at least wounded one of them. But I should have told you that although the place was very dark, yet he made no doubt, by the glare and flashes from the eyes, that they were cats. And when he came up with the light, they were all vanished, and only some blood left upon the floor. There was an old woman that lived about 2 miles from the laird's habitation, reputed to be a witch. Her he greatly suspected to be one of the confederacy, and immediately he hasted away to her hut, and entering he found her laying upon the bed and bleeding excessively. This alone was some confirmation of the justice of his suspicion, but casting his eye under the bed, there lay her leg in its natural form. This extraordinary narrative reveals how shape-shifting beliefs created evidence that seemed to prove supernatural transformation. The legal power of such evidence lay in its apparent objectivity. Unlike spectral evidence that revealed an invisible testimony, shape-shifting charges could point to physical wounds, timing correlations, and witness observations that seemed to demonstrate supernatural transformation through empirical proof. Courts claimed they were following evidence rather than supernatural speculation, while reaching predetermined conclusions about diabolic conspiracy. Travelling witch finders developed standard procedures for discovering metamorphosis evidence, teaching local authorities how to recognise signs of supernatural transformation and exact confessions that would satisfy legal requirements while eliminating targeted individuals. The machinery worked exactly as designed, transforming social tensions into supernatural prosecutions that reinforced existing power structures while appearing to protect communities from diabolic conspiracy. Modern legal scholars studying these historical precedents emphasise how quickly legitimate institutions can be corrupted when fear overcomes reason. The most disturbing lesson from this legal history is how ordinary people participated willingly in systematic judicial murder when provided with intellectual frameworks that made it seem righteous and necessary. From Salem's spectral evidence to Scotland's royal torture sessions, we witnessed how educated professionals deliberately abandoned legal principles while maintaining facades of legitimate procedure. The techniques developed for hunting invisible enemies established precedents that could be revived when new targets required elimination. My 1847 London Journal articles serve as both historical record and warning about the fragility of legal institutions when confronted with social anxiety. The voices of the condemned remind us that justice requires eternal vigilance against those who would sacrifice legal principles for the comfort of easy answers to complex problems. Their suffering demands that we remember how quickly legitimate institutions can become engines of oppression when fear triumphs over fairness. In the next episode, we'll delve into the supernatural signs that marked someone as a witch, the demonic familiars that served as hell's messengers, and the systematic torture techniques that transformed innocent confessions into evidence of diabolical conspiracy. Until next time, may your alibis be stronger than your spectral evidence, and may your pets remain suspiciously ordinary. This has been Vices and Volumes. I'm Avril. Thank you for listening.